They wore white linen, 85 men consecrated to the service of the altar, their hands marked by incense, and their knees worn from kneeling on stone. And in a single day, every one of them was slaughtered on the orders of the very king who was supposed to protect them. This is the story of the massacre at Nob. To understand what drove a king of Israel to order the execution of nearly 100 priests, you need to go back several months and examine the mental state of a man who had long since lost the ability to distinguish allies from enemies. Saul, son of Kish, of the tribe of Benjamin, had occupied the throne for more than 2 decades. He had been anointed by the prophet Samuel at roughly 30 years old, and now, approaching 60, he ruled a territory of just over 25,000 square kilometers with an estimated permanent military force of 3,000 to 6,000 soldiers. He was Israel's first king, and he carried the weight of having been chosen by God and then rejected by him. 1 Samuel chapter 15 verse 26 records Samuel telling Saul that the Lord had rejected him as king. From that moment, the biblical narrative describes a downward spiral that transformed a hesitant leader into a paranoid tyrant. The immediate trigger for that spiral had a name: David. The young shepherd from Bethlehem had entered Saul's court as a musician, playing the harp to ease the episodes the biblical text describes as a harmful spirit from the Lord, as in 1 Samuel chapter 16 verse 14. Then came the victory over Goliath in the valley of Elah, and with it a phrase Saul could never unhear. The women of Israel sang in the streets, "Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s." 1 Samuel chapter 18 verse 7. From that point forward, Saul watched David with suspicion. The Hebrew verb used is specific. It was not merely jealousy, it was obsessive surveillance. Consider what happens when a man with absolute power loses the capacity to trust. Saul attempted to kill David with a spear at least twice inside the palace itself, as recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 19 verses 10 and 11. He sent soldiers to David's house to assassinate him in the night. He hunted him through the wilderness of Ziph, through the wilderness of Maon, through the caves of En-Gedi. He mobilized 3,000 of Israel's finest men solely to hunt him down, according to 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse 2. And while Saul burned military resources on this obsession, the Philistines continued pressing the borders to the west and north, threatening cities like Keilah, less than 40 kilometers from Jerusalem. It was against this backdrop of institutionalized paranoia that David arrived at Nob. The city stood a few kilometers north of Jerusalem, most likely in the region of the Mount of Olives, on an elevation that allowed a clear view of the Kidron Valley. Nob was no ordinary city. After the destruction of the tabernacle at Shiloh by the Philistines, around 1050 BCE, the priests had transferred part of the sacred service to this location. Nob functioned as the principal religious center of Israel during that period. There the priestly ephod was kept, along with the bread of the presence and various consecrated objects, including the sword of Goliath, preserved as a trophy wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod, according to 1 Samuel chapter 21, verse 9. Consider what Nob represented. It was the equivalent of the seat of an entire nation's religious power, concentrated in a single city of perhaps 200 to 300 people, the majority of them priests and their families, men who dedicated every day to the service of the altar, preparing offerings, maintaining the sacred fire, baking the 12 loaves of the presence that were exchanged each Sabbath. Men whose hands held not swords but sacrificial knives. Men who wore not armor but linen ephods. David arrived alone, hungry, unarmed, fleeing. Ahimelech the priest, son of Ahitub, came out to meet David trembling. The text is explicit. 1 Samuel chapter 21 verse 1 records that Ahimelech came trembling to meet David and asked why he was alone. The presence of a court official without a military escort was anomalous. David lied. He said he was on a secret mission from the king and that his men were waiting for him elsewhere. Ahimelech, having no reason to doubt the king's son-in-law, provided what David requested. First, the bread of the presence, which by Leviticus chapter 24 verse 9 could only be consumed by priests, but which in a situation of extreme necessity could be given to laymen, provided they were ritually pure. Then, the sword of Goliath, the only weapon available in that sanctuary. And here is the detail that transformed an act of priestly hospitality into a collective death sentence. At that exact moment, inside the sanctuary compound, a man was watching everything. Doeg the Edomite, chief of Saul's herdsmen. The text of 1 Samuel chapter 21 verse 7 says he was detained before the Lord, which most likely means he was fulfilling some kind of vow or ritual quarantine. Doeg was not an Israelite. He was an Edomite, a descendant of Esau, belonging to a people who had maintained uneasy relations with Israel for centuries. His position as the king's chief herdsman implied responsibility over flocks that could number in the thousands of cattle and sheep, which meant control over a significant portion of the royal wealth. He was a man Saul trusted, and he was watching everything. Silence. David left with the bread and the sword. Ahimelech returned to his priestly duties. Doeg kept what he had seen, and for a time, nothing happened. Life at Nob continued as before. The priests rose before dawn, around 4:30 in the morning, to prepare the morning offerings. Incense was burned twice daily. The loaves were baked with fine flour, likely around 22 liters of flour per week for the 12 loaves. The priestly service was physically demanding. These men spent hours standing on stone floors, carried animals to sacrifice, handled burning coals, cleaned blood. Many developed joint and back problems before the age of 40. Their hands were permanently marked with small burns from the altar. Meanwhile, Saul was consuming himself. The king was at Gibeah, sitting under a tamarisk tree on the hill, spear in hand, surrounded by his servants, all Benjaminites. 1 Samuel chapter 22, verses 6 and 7 records a revealing scene. Saul was not planning military strategy or governing. He was sitting, gripping his spear the way a man sleeps with a weapon under his pillow, accusing his own officers of conspiracy. His words were direct. "Hear now, you Benjaminites. Will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards? Will he make you all commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds?" The accusation was clear. Saul believed everyone was conspiring against him, that everyone preferred David, that even his own tribal kinsmen had abandoned him. It was at that moment that Doeg spoke. Place in perspective what Doeg did. He was not being interrogated. He was not under pressure. He volunteered to speak. 1 Samuel chapter 22 verses 9 and 10 shows Doeg responding of his own accord, saying he had seen the son of Jesse come to Nob, to Ahimelech the son of Ahitub, and that Ahimelech inquired of the Lord for him, gave him provisions, and also gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. The mention of an inquiry of the Lord may have been an embellishment on Doeg's part, or accurate information, since Ahimelech possessed the ephod, the priestly instrument used to consult the divine will through the Urim and Thummim. In any case, to Saul, it was the confirmation of everything he feared. The decision was immediate. Saul summoned Ahimelech and all the priests of Nob, all of them. The text uses the phrase, "all his father's house," which encompassed every priest, every Levite, every sanctuary attendant belonging to that lineage. Consider what it meant to pull 85 men from their sacred duties and march them to Gibeah. The distance between Nob and Gibeah was approximately 5 to 8 kilometers, roughly an hour and a half on foot. 85 priests crossing the hills of Benjamin, dressed in white linen, not knowing they were walking to their deaths. Ahimelech stood before Saul, and the interrogation that followed reveals the tragedy of an innocent man trying to reason with madness. Saul accused Ahimelech of conspiring with David, of giving him bread and a sword, and of inquiring of God on his behalf. Ahimelech's response is recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 22, verses 14 and 15. He said, "And who among all your servants is so faithful as David, who is the king's son-in-law and captain over your bodyguard, and honored in your house?" The defense was logical, rational, airtight. Ahimelech had helped the king's son-in-law because he believed he was acting in the king's service. There was no conspiracy, there was no betrayal. There was only a priest doing what any priest would do when a royal official came asking for food. It did not matter. Saul pronounced the sentence, "You shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and all your father's house." The punishment was not individual. It was collective. It applied not only to the high priest, but to the entire lineage. 85 men condemned for an action that only one of them had taken, and that one had taken in good faith. Then Saul gave the order to his guards, "Turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because their hand also is with David, and because they knew that he fled and did not disclose it to me." 1 Samuel chapter 22, verse 17. Examine the phrasing. Saul called them priests of the Lord and still ordered their execution. He knew exactly who he was commanding to be killed. They were not combatants. They were not spies. They were men of God. And then something happened that reveals the moral threshold that existed even within a court ruled by fear. The guards refused. The text is precise. The king's servants would not put out their hand to strike the priests of the Lord. Soldiers trained to follow orders on the battlefield, men who had likely killed Philistines and Ammonites, refused to lay a hand on the priests. The refusal was not a matter of cowardice, it was sacred terror. In Israelite culture, a priest was inviolable. To strike a priest was to strike God himself. Saul's soldiers were prepared to die in combat, but they were not prepared to carry the curse of priestly blood on their hands. Saul turned to Doeg. "You turn and strike the priests." The order was direct, and Doeg obeyed. 1 Samuel chapter 22, verse 18 records, "Then Doeg the Edomite turned and struck down the priests, and he killed on that day 85 persons who wore the linen ephod." 85. Witness the scene as ancient texts allow it to be reconstructed. 85 men dressed in white linen, the fabric worn exclusively in priestly service, unarmed, many of them likely kneeling or in prayer, executed by a single man with a sword. The logistics of the slaughter are disturbing. If Doeg took approximately 2 minutes per execution, the massacre lasted nearly 3 hours. 3 hours of white linen turning red, 3 hours of screams of pleas, of prayers cut short by the edge of a blade. The blood of 85 men has a volume of approximately 425 liters. That is the equivalent of filling 2 large bathtubs to the brim. The ground at Gibeah absorbed all of it in a single day. But Doeg did not stop at the priests. The solution created a new problem in Saul's mind. If the priests were dead, their families would become witnesses and potential agents of vengeance. The next order was total. 1 Samuel chapter 22, verse 19 describes what came after. "And Nob, the city of the priests, he put to the sword. Both man and woman, child and infant, ox, donkey and sheep, he put to the sword." Nob was annihilated. Grasp the magnitude of what that means. An entire city with an estimated population of 200 to 300 people, including the elderly pregnant women nursing infants, was wiped from the map. The animals were slaughtered. The structures were most likely burned. The sanctuary, which had housed sacred objects for decades, was destroyed. The irony is devastating. Saul, who had been rebuked by God for failing to completely destroy the Amalekites as commanded in 1 Samuel chapter 15, now applied the herem, the total consecrated destruction against priests of Israel's own God. What he had refused to do to enemies, he did to servants of the altar. Compare Nob with what Saul had spared at Amalek. At Amalek, Saul preserved King Agag and the best of the livestock, directly disobeying the divine command. At Nob, he destroyed everything utterly, without any divine command, driven by paranoia alone. The inversion is complete. Where he should have destroyed, he spared. Where he should have protected, he annihilated. The human cost of Nob extends beyond the numbers. Consider the families of those priests. Each of the 85 men almost certainly had a wife and children, estimating an average of 4 to 5 people per household. The massacre destroyed between 350 and 425 lives directly. Women who woke that morning baking barley bread, children playing among the tents, infants who had not yet reached 6 months of age. The sound that went silent in Nob that day was not only the liturgical chanting of the priests, it was the crying of newborns, the laughter of children, the murmur of ordinary domestic life, and there were physical consequences for Doeg himself. A man executing 85 people with a sword suffers extreme muscular fatigue by the 20th or 30th killing. The muscles of the forearm and shoulder go into lactic acid accumulation. The grip becomes slippery with sweat and blood. The edge of the blade loses efficiency after the first 20 to 30 strokes through fabric, flesh, and bone. It is likely that Doeg had to change weapons or stop to rest. The brutality was not only moral, it was physical, mechanical, exhausting. But someone escaped. Abiathar, son of Ahimelech, managed to flee. 1 Samuel chapter 22 verse 20 records that one of the sons of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. The text does not explain how he escaped. Perhaps he was in another part of the city when the massacre began. Perhaps he ran when he heard the first screams. What is known is that he carried with him the priestly ephod, the most important instrument in Israelite religion for consulting the divine will. Consider the significance of that. The ephod weighed between 5 and 8 kilograms, was made of finely woven linen, interlaced with threads of gold, blue, purple, and scarlet, according to Exodus chapter 28. It contained the breastpiece bearing the 12 stones representing the tribes of Israel, and the pouches holding the Urim and Thummim, the pieces used to obtain divine answers. Abiathar fled carrying in his hands the only formal channel of communication between God and Israel. When he reached David, the future king gained not merely a priest. He gained the religious legitimacy that Saul had just finished destroying. David's reaction upon learning of the massacre reveals something about his character. 1 Samuel chapter 22 verse 22 records David saying to Abiathar, "I knew on that day, when Doeg the Edomite was there, that he would surely tell Saul, 'I have occasioned the death of all the persons of your father's house.'" David accepted responsibility. He acknowledged that his lie to Ahimelech had set in motion the chain of events that led to the massacre. He did not deflect. He did not blame Saul exclusively. He admitted that his presence at Nob, his false story about the royal mission, his decision to seek help from a sanctuary monitored by one of Saul's informants, had all contributed to that outcome. And then he made a promise to Abiathar. "Stay with me. Do not be afraid, for he who seeks my life seeks your life. With me you shall be in safekeeping." 1 Samuel chapter 22 verse 23. The covenant was sealed, the priest and the future king bound together by the blood of Nob's dead. There then arises the question that the ancient texts allow us to reconstruct. What did the massacre mean for the political and religious structure of Israel? Before Nob, Saul still maintained an appearance of legitimacy. He had an army, a court, tribal allies. After Nob, something changed irreversibly. The priesthood, which was the institutional pillar that validated the monarchy before the people, had been transferred to David's side. Abiathar inquired of the Lord for David using the ephod, as recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 23, verse 6. When David needed to decide whether to attack the Philistines at Keilah, he consulted the ephod. When he needed to know whether the inhabitants of Keilah would hand him over to Saul, he consulted the ephod. The most powerful religious instrument in Israel now served the fugitive, not the king. The psychological impact on the people was equally devastating. Nob was known as the city of the priests. Every Israelite who passed through the region of Benjamin knew that the servants of the altar lived there. The news that the king had exterminated an entire priestly city must have spread across the tribes with the speed of fire through dry straw. In a society where Israel's total population was estimated between 300,000 and 400,000 people, the destruction of a priestly city was an event that struck the consciousness of the entire nation. It was as if the head of a country had ordered the destruction of a great cathedral with all its clergy inside. The violation was simultaneously political, religious, and moral. Saul's own guards had refused the order. That detail cannot be understated. When a king's soldiers refuse to carry out a command, the king's power is already fundamentally broken. Military obedience is the last pillar of any monarchy. If the soldiers disobey, the king rules in name only. Saul was forced to turn to a foreigner to do what his own men considered unthinkable. Doeg the Edomite did not carry the weight of Israelite priestly law on his shoulders. For him, the priests of a God who was not his own did not carry the same inviolability. The choice of Doeg as the executioner was not accidental. He was the only man available who could do the work without being paralyzed by sacred terror. Psalm 52 preserves the poetic memory of that event. The heading of the psalm attributes its composition to David, when Doeg the Edomite came and told Saul that David had gone to the house of Ahimelech. The psalm does not narrate the massacre directly. It does something more penetrating. It describes Doeg's character. Why do you boast of evil, O mighty man? Your tongue plots destruction. You love evil more than good, and lying more than speaking what is right. The psalm transforms Doeg into the archetype of the man who wields his tongue as a weapon, who gains power through denunciation, who builds his position on the corpses of the innocent. The spilled blood was not the end. Now the consequences spread outward like ripples on water. The destruction of Nob eliminated an entire generation of trained priests. The Israelite priestly service demanded years of preparation. A priest began his training around the age of 25 and assumed full duties only at 30, according to Numbers, chapter 4, verse 3. The 85 men killed represented centuries of accumulated liturgical knowledge, sacrificial techniques, and oral traditions concerning sacred procedures. Each priest carried in memory dozens of regulations, prayer formulas, and methods for preparing offerings. When Doeg cut those 85 throats, he also cut a living library of sacred knowledge that no scroll could recover. Compare that loss to something tangible. It is as if a single event simultaneously destroyed the medical faculty, the Supreme Court, and the national library of a country. The religious infrastructure of Israel suffered a blow from which it took generations to fully recover. Only under David's reign, years later, was the priesthood reorganized, with Abiathar and Zadok serving as joint high priests, as recorded in 2 Samuel, chapter 8, verse 17. And what became of Saul after Nob? The biblical narrative shows a man whose spiral continued without restraint. In the months following the massacre, Saul pursued David through the wilderness of Ziph with 3,000 men, roughly 3 times the force needed to capture a band of 600 fugitives. He entered a cave at En-Gedi, where David cut the corner of his robe without Saul noticing, demonstrating that he could have killed him and chose not to. 1 Samuel chapter 24. Later, David slipped into Saul's camp at night and took his spear and water jug while the king and his entire army slept. 1 Samuel chapter 26. On both occasions, David spared Saul. The man Saul wanted to kill was the one man who refused to kill him. The system held for years before it broke. Saul died on Mount Gilboa in battle against the Philistines. 1 Samuel chapter 31. His 3 sons died with him, including Jonathan, David's closest friend. When the Philistines found Saul's body, they cut off his head and hung his armor in the temple of Ashtaroth, and his body was fastened to the wall of Beth-shan. The king, who had beheaded 85 priests, was himself beheaded by pagans. Abiathar, the survivor of Nob, served David for decades. He remained as high priest throughout David's entire reign, some 40 years. He watched Jerusalem fall. He watched the Ark of the Covenant brought into the capital to the sound of trumpets and dancing. He watched the throne that Saul had tried to protect with priestly blood be occupied by the man who had sheltered the only priest to escape that bloodshed. But even Abiathar carried the scars of Nob. When David grew old and the question of succession divided the court, Abiathar chose the wrong side, throwing his support behind Adonijah instead of Solomon. 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 26 and 27 records that Solomon expelled Abiathar from the priesthood, fulfilling the word of the Lord against the house of Eli. Abiathar ended his days in Anathoth, a priestly city roughly 5 kilometers north of Jerusalem, far from the temple, far from the altar, far from everything his father had served and for which his father had died. Modern archaeology is still looking for Nob. The exact location has never been identified with absolute certainty. Candidates include Mount Scopus, the village of Isawiya, and the region of Ras el-Mesharif, all north of Jerusalem, at distances ranging from 2 to 4 kilometers from the old city. The absence of archaeological evidence is not surprising. A small city completely destroyed in the 11th century BCE, with all its structures likely burned and its inhabitants eliminated, would leave little trace after 3,000 years of occupation, erosion, and reconstruction in the most contested region on Earth. What remained of Nob is not in the ground. It is in the text. 85 men in white linen died because a priest gave bread to a hungry fugitive. They died because a foreigner watched and reported. They died because a king could no longer separate reality from the shadows that haunted his own mind. They died unarmed, without fair trial, without any possibility of defense, executed by hands that were not of Israel, at the command of a king who no longer governed himself. And yet, the massacre that was meant to eliminate all priestly support for David accomplished precisely the opposite. It drove religious legitimacy to the side of the fugitive. It transformed the hunted into the protector of the last surviving priest. It gave David the ephod, the instrument of divine inquiry, and with it the ability to make God-directed decisions at every crossroads of his flight and his rise. What appeared to be the final severing of the bond between David and the sacred became, by an inversion no human strategy could have engineered, the very mechanism that cemented that bond forever. Nob vanished from the map, but the blood of those 85 men in linen never dried in the memory of Israel, and the sword an Edomite raised against servants of the altar cut, in the end, the very legitimacy of the throne it was meant to protect.